Customer needs are changing. We've just talked about some of that in the slide, and I think one of the things that's really interesting to our people is, I saw a subject in the agenda that talked about, the major challenges in Asia Pacific, and I think that's probably a very broad place to start, but it's not a bad place to start, and we'll kind of narrow it down from there. Marco, I'm going to come straight to you because I want to pick up on a conversation you and I had in KL just recently, and it started with touching on some of those highlights that we just saw on the slides around what those challenges are. One of which was, can we manage Asia as a whole, or do we need to start looking at compartmentalising elements of Asia? Your views on that? Are we being too ambitious to think about it as a whole?
I think Asia is quite diverse. I do a lot of work in Indonesia. Indonesia is a region by itself, very challenged with logistics infrastructure problems. So you see a big diversity within Asia, countries like Indonesia, and you see countries like where we now, Singapore, which is very much developed. Malaysia is also heading towards a developed nation. So you see very big differences. So I think Malaysia and Singapore you can see as one region, and maybe even you could extend that to Thailand. But Indonesia is very much different. Myanmar, Vietnam, Cambodia, these are ex-communistic countries that are now getting more modern. I think a lot of opportunities there. So I think I would split it in those three. So Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia as a zone by itself, and then those ex-communist countries.
Is it imperative for success that they do that going forward? Is that an imperative, or is it a nice to have? Is it a nice to, if you don't have the scale of your business, can you still consider Asia as one, or do you think that actually we really need to start reshaping how we think about it?
No, I think very difficult to see it as one. It requires different logistics models. Like in Indonesia, you have to need more logistics infrastructure. Every island, you need to have a distribution system, which is very much different than those other land-based countries.
Vikram, I'm sorry, I am going to dance around. I'm not going to do the traditional up and down. Your views, trade cluster, single market. Marco just talked about the fragmented nature of the logistics in Indonesia. Is that your experience with the UTI business as well, that your customers are now saying, actually, we have different demands for certain clusters and we want to align those demands to the clusters that are most similar?
Yeah, thanks. I think so, because having been down that road for a couple of years now in UTI, it really, one depends on how you define Asia, what's the geography that you're talking about. But if you were to consider Japan, Korea, right down to Australia, New Zealand, across the Indian subcontinent, there's massive diversity in that. So I think two things. One, you have to set up something that really reflects the diversity and manage that effectively. And the second is, it also depends on where you are in your company in terms of standardization versus destandardization, centralization versus decentralization. And they do mean two very different things as well. So,
and are they changing? I mean, the inquiries that you're fielding today versus, say, 10 years ago, is that conversation changing? Because we did see a large push 10 years ago towards standardised facilities, standardised ways of operating, centralised decision making. Is that shifted? I see, Elaine, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you like to comment on that? I mean, what are your customers telling you around this standardised versus destandardised? We've seen specialist operations?
Yeah, I think so. I think globalization and all the trends that you mentioned has redefined a lot of the customer needs. The growth trends, etc., more focused on Asia versus Asia being exporting, as you mentioned earlier. I think that has also had an impact on the way we structure our business in Asia Pacific. I mean, like UTIC was going through a similar model change this year, into smaller countries. But it's not just clubbing the region into smaller chunks. It is more of, in actual fact, people don't move. The reality is it's gone more globalization in terms of decision making. You still have people in the region, but they report globally without the regional layer. And then it's more also impacting the business on the ground, because what was mentioned, Indonesia is so large, it could be a region by itself. So the focus in the country is extremely critical. So you localize a little bit more, and you globalize, some of the regions in the past rather than having it operating in silos. I think that's the evolution of what 3PLs like us are doing in attendant to what customers are doing. Actually, a lot of consumer retail customers are structured very similar to what I see as well.
Chris, you just made a note there, which I got the benefit of looking over your shoulder on. But I mean, are your manufacturing customers now saying to you, actually, we want some advice, we want some input on how to reshape our manufacturing for a domestic consumption or an Asia consumption, as opposed to being traditionally low-cost manufacturing, put it there, export back into the more mature markets? Are you seeing a shift in the way your manufacturing customers are talking to you?
Yes, I think one of the big trends, I think you touched on it in your presentation, was actually producing for local demand. If I look at what's going on in China, it's factories are shifting over to produce locally rather than for the export market.
So reshaping.
And we're almost seeing, I think this is a larger global trend. We're similarly sort of almost at proximity, where we're actually seeing, instead of having one large manufacturing plant somewhere, you're actually going to split it up into multiple smaller manufacturing plants closer to demand. Now, the interesting thing is that the complexity increases dramatically. So you go from, say, one plant managing one supply chain to 4 plants managing 4 supply chains, etc., etc. So I think that's certainly the trend that we're actually going to see more and more. But the other thing I think as well, just to touch on it again, just coming back to the conversation I had in the last couple of days, was all around government initiatives to bring in companies to set up. High-tech manufacturing. Every 5 years we're retooling, we're setting up a new plant. The question is, what's in it for me to go and set up a new plant? And certainly you're starting to see India starting to look at developing that high-tech manufacturing sector. You're starting to see Vietnam, again, maybe be a bit of resurgence on there. And you're even starting to see some countries in the Middle East, for example, starting to look at trying to attract investment there, because again, it's not massive amounts of infrastructure, it's not massive amounts of raw material that are required. So again, I think it's people are constantly just looking at what's next.
Jim, you've had a lot of experience in helping organisations implement strategies around this very thing. You've heard the comments from Elaine and from Chris. What are you seeing as some of the more strategic shifts in decision making around the timelines to do that? And does this whole, please bring, I want to encourage you to come and invest in my country or my particular region. There's some incentives for you. Is our logistics infrastructure supporting that? Are we still making decisions based on?
Probably strategic level. If you look at Jokowi going to the US for the AIDS situation, look at Modi shaking hands with Obama or going to Europe. It's like, okay, the idea is there, all the plans are there, but when it starts cascading down to the SME and the private organizations, Singapore is an exception, and probably China as well, because I think China is a shift in policies where China says we're going to do it the right way and growth is going to be sustainable at 6.5, so we're not away from the country, etc. But if you look at how the market, consumers are behaving, it's about today when we talk to the high-tech customers or some of our competitors, it's the biggest market has the biggest say. So if Indonesia is growing and the consumer power is there, or India is growing, you see that the e-commerce push is going to be in those countries, right? Because that's where things are going to happen. Plans are going to be there, and all the virtual malls, virtual stores are going to be there, getting ready for the next curve, right? So I think it's no longer a 5 years plan, 10 years plan. Long ago when sit and interview, people will say, what are you going to do 10 years from now? I think now it's about 2 years, 3 years from now, what are you going to do? Tell me about
more short term.
What's your wish list? And same, right, for a consumer, it's an instant generation today. I want this now, it's instant edification. So it's talking about e-commerce and I want this instantaneously. So I think the mindset is going to shift quite drastically.
Marco, Chris talked about the move from this big, huge, giant manufacturing facility to now more smaller, more refined, market-specific manufacturing for that immediate consumer. How important does technology become in making that possible, and more importantly, continue to drive the efficiencies you have in a large operation into that smaller facility?
Yeah, for countries like Indonesia, it's very important to do local production, especially if you talk about FMCG products. I think for other countries, you still see regional production, like Unilever, they produce ice creams out of Thailand for the whole region. So I think it's a mixed bag. And so not necessarily that you see everything local production. Certainly you need big capacity economies of scale to do that. In terms of logistics, I think what is really needed here is city logistics. City logistics have been concepts which I'm very familiar with back in Holland. We also did innovative logistics concept like district ship, which is a floating warehouse in the canals in Holland, where we challenged the assumption of without below 150 kilometers we don't do any intermodal transport. We said, well, not necessarily. Let's challenge that. And same here in Singapore, we sit next to the water. I was yesterday having my dinner at Boat Quay, beautiful water. So can we have delivery to those restaurants and pubs via the water instead of the road? So I think be more critical about city logistics will be something important for Asia, especially with the high urbanization.
And is that possibly where we see the shift in the last mile piece becoming much more adaptable to different methodologies? I mean, because at the moment, last mile means the guy that brings the parcel to the desk, right?
It will be extremely important. In Indonesia, I talk to logistics service providers and say, how many trips can you make per truck per day? And they said, less than one per day. It's unbelievable. If you really look at truck utilization, if you go one level deeper, how much time you physically spend on the road with a full truck, and then your delays you have before loading, and then delays you have on the road, and then delays after unloading, and then you're running the rest of the trip empty. Truck utilization is something, if it was a factory, you would have closed down a factory if you had those numbers. And we are accepting that as okay for the logistics industry.
Vikram, you're nodding your head. I want to come to you on this. I was going to talk about transport a bit further on, but we'll get deep dive right into it now. Utilisation. How much empty space are we carrying around, and how, what's the advice to organisations that you give in terms of how to refine your capacity and increase your asset turn in transportation? Because there is a whole buy-sell model in Asia, which there's not a lot of operators with assets, and the mums and pups are still pretty prominent, particularly in emerging markets. So it's easy to buy in capacity, but we don't really think about utilisation very well.
Yeah, I mean, as we see the squeeze coming in all elements of transportation, this is something that is a very common conversation that we have with our clients. And I think both with the operators and the owners as well as with clients, there's many interesting models that you can talk about that will probably necessitate a model shift, but could increase utilization, could increase the number of milk runs that we do into facility. I mean, we do a lot of business with the automotive sector, for example, in Thailand, where actual utilization is literally as shocking as what Marco just pointed out. So, it's a big conversation and something where, it depends on really the innovation that both sides have to changing this that can drive a difference and change for the client as well. But, I'd say in conversations with clients, this would probably come up easily amongst the top 5 that we have with, people that are very, very focused on lowering transportation costs, increasing utilization right now.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, we were doing some work with a retailer in New Zealand, and they were starting to explore an Uber-type model for the last mile delivery, and really trying to actually disrupt what was actually going on. And I've started to see some other conversations going on now in Australia as well, and actually saying, well, if people are driving down there, what can I actually ship down there? So again, I do think that
there's a change that's about to take place. Is it the technology that's going to link that together? Because Uber's success is in its cloud technology-based applications and widespread adoption of that, right?
one of the things, I had a whole list of predictions, but one of them is we stop asking what we can run as a service model, but almost what we can't. So again, we do. So
assume that every asset that's in the network is available.
To see that everything will actually move towards some form of sharing. And I think that could be a real disruption.
Jim, just before you get into that, I want to ask Elaine a question because I think if I look down there, you've got a couple of 3PLs here, and I've given Vikram an opportunity to talk about technology. But I spent a lot of time in Thailand, and one of my customers in Thailand runs a very large, sophisticated fleet with a lot of onboard technology around vehicle monitoring. What is SEVA doing to develop future technologies for transportation, given that a large part of what you do is the buy-sell model for transport? I mean, are you exploring opportunities for managing the abnormal in your transport systems that help your customers drive efficiency, load utilization, vehicle disruption, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we do all of that most of the time. I think the customers are, I think for us, it's about how we can help the customers optimize their transport systems, deal with the disruptions. You know, Indonesia, Thailand are very complex areas where transports are always impacted by disruptions, regardless of what happens. The other part is also to try to link as much as possible the services together from a solution perspective to enable a lot of the deliveries to happen based on the needs and to also transform the consumer requirements a little bit, looking at the front and back to see how much more flexibility you can push into the transport arena. I think those are some of the things that we're constantly looking for. The other thing that we need to be mindful of is also the cost. Right? Any technology, any innovation needs to have a proper ROI, because the reality of the fact is that everybody manages the cost, and that's the P&L mentality. So even if we have the best technology or the most innovative technology, to me it's all about the ROI from that technology that will make the difference.
Jim, you had a comment you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I know that technology is very advanced or very disruptive, as you can say. You know, there are a lot of the forwarders out there, or even third-party providers that gives you good business analytics, business intelligence. But then it's the practical use of it. I mean, you can have a lot of data, and then how do you extract it? One example is we had an American provider for the healthcare and pharmaceutical, and they came up with a technology to indicate for the next every month or every week how temperature control in the freighter, in the air freight containers is going to be routed through different places. So obviously in summer, if you route it through Dubai, you're going to get a huge excursion. Or if you route it during the winter time through certain European or American countries, the temperature is going to drop too much, right? But then, how does that impact you as a shipper or customer? It really depends, because at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get at is the technology and the advancement of all these solutions. What does it really mean? And does it really come up with something useful? I think today we hub on the omni-channel and the Internet of Things, and how does that whole thing become something practical for a user perspective? Because within the user, you have all the different camps. We talked about yesterday. The finance guy wants savings. The operation guy wants fastest, shorter lead time, and then the procurement guy has another thing on his agenda. So it's about packaging that as well as making sure that it's something practical and useful.
So let's ask our internet thing expert down here. Right? Can for the finance guys that didn't put their hand up earlier on, can Jim talked about the fact that you've got to deploy it, but you've got to realise the value of it. Does it actually save money? Does it improve our operations? Does cloud technology make the scale easier for smaller companies to adopt?
I mean, okay, I think you just asked for a half-day workshop, but I'll try and summarise that very quickly.
I'm sure Sarah will give us a few more hours if we talk nicely to Richard.
I mean, the first thing, we talk a lot about business intelligence and analytics, but what actually most people talk about is a report. We just generate another report, or we have another dashboard. So
it's only important if we use it. And so
I'm spending time in companies, and I'm hearing the comment, oh great, another dashboard. Another thing that I don't actually have time to look at and read, and by the time I've delved down through 8 screens, I might actually find something of use. So again, what we're actually suggesting is that when we actually talk around business intelligence analytics, it's actually got to lead to an action. And this is where you're starting to see almost facilitated decision making. So this is where, this is where you actually see the options that you've got presented to you, not another report. Okay.
So the exceptions reporting telling me how to actually drive my business, not just something for me to read. Give me this. So that's that cognitive behaviour.
Customer A, upset customer B, upset customer C into how much. I mean, so that's one. The other one that I want to get to, and again, this is something that's quite contrarian, but I think it's a great thing, is actually starting to look at the removal of Excel from the organisation.
How many people still do forecasting demand planning on Excel? Any hands?
Don't be embarrassed.
Come on, there's one, two, there's a couple.
We know you all do, it's probably easy to ask those who don't. But again, I mean, one of the things, as soon as we actually put all our data on Excel, the data is effectively out of date. And if you think about your management meetings, typically the first half of the meeting is actually spent arguing who's got the most up-to-date data. So I've seen one organisation here in Singapore, they've literally banned Excel from the meeting room. And what they do, they actually trust the data, and they actually show the data direct from the enterprise system on the screen, and actually discuss that.
In real time.
In real time. So again, just talking about where people are really using technology to make a difference.
Nowhere to hide.
So, I'm sorry, and the third one is around IoT. And actually, I mean, IoT, we've got to get out of the dashboard thing, and we're now starting to see this idea around fog computing. I hate to throw another jargon thing out there. But what this is actually starting to see decision making actually at the device level. So we're seeing the self-correcting machines. Now, we've been doing this for quite a while. You know, in manufacturing, it's always been there. We've started to actually say, take the data, and then if it starts to go out of tolerance, what can we actually do to rebalance it? So instead of just reporting on it, we're now seeing that self-correction type of capability. So again, when we start talking around efficiency and where the technology is going, it's all around driving the efficiency. It's just at the moment, people are actually not taking full advantage of it. And again, there's the challenges around are actually understanding the process, understanding the technology, getting the right data, because, I mean, data quality is always a challenge as well. But
much of that's about moving it from a passive environment to one that's actually giving us behavioural analysis and then decision making.
And the investment in it. And again, I mean, I talk to a lot of companies, and the biggest challenges are actually finding people who actually understand the data, and you're starting to move it from almost the data scientist to almost the, I'm even hearing the phrase the storyteller, the person who actually can piece all this data together and actually turn it into the information. But that becomes a real challenge because, I mean, there's fact and there's fiction. So
that 50% of the workforce that's going to lose their jobs because of technology, we'll just reskill them. Mark, I want to change vein altogether. I want to talk about free trade agreements, AEC, and I know you've done a lot of work in this area. TPP, AEC, REPLA, I mean, acronyms after acronyms, but Silk Road development. Are we really going to see significant shifts because of that? And over what period of time should we be looking to factor those into our decision making?
I think there will be changes over time. What I see, unfortunately, also that some countries are creating non-tariff or even kind of new tariff trade barriers. Indonesia, for example, is not ready for AEC, right? They don't have the ports. If you open up all AEC, right, then it would be easier to supply from Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, all the Indonesian islands, than from Java itself. So it's not in the interest of Indonesia to open up its borders, because Java will lose out big time. So what they're doing now, they're creating all those hurdles to get in. And other countries, including Malaysia.
So for here, you're right. What we're doing is, in some markets, we're scrambling to put barriers in before we actually start taking those barriers out. Does that mean that the likes of, say, TPP becomes a much more important agreement for us to focus on the short term, whereby we've actually already done the reverse of that? We've started with saying there's a baseline that's zero, and we work backwards from there?
I think definitely for countries such as Malaysia and Vietnam, that would be very attractive. I'm not sure about Singapore, because if you remember, Singapore had the most FTAs in the world. So if now our neighboring countries also getting a little bit closer on par with Singapore, I'm not sure.
We lose
Singapore was the gateway, they had all the connections to the world. But now Malaysia and Vietnam might be quite similar.
Is there anyone in the room from EDB that can possibly share those views? We're reasonably safe. Vikram, your customers, I mean, what's the advice that you're giving your customers in terms of how to take advantage of some of these opportunities that are created by free trade agreements? I mean, because that would be an increasingly more important part of your conversation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, I mean, so AEC and TPP and, whatever gets momentum first, I think is really going to lead to two different kinds of changes when it comes to the 3PL side, right? So when you're talking about TPP, you're talking about the countries that are involved, you're talking more about, multimodal kind of shift that's going to happen and growth and expansion that's going to happen. When you're talking about the AEC, I think it's fundamentally going to change, the way clients manage their distribution centers, for example. The way clients are now looking at this ground strategy and really what it means from an implementation, what it means from an operator standpoint. And so I think we're well advised to kind of tackle both of them simultaneously at the same time. But again, recognizing that on both sides there are government statutory constraints and issues that need to be addressed first before they come. But certainly, something worth blueprinting on, certainly something worth talking about when you look at client needs and then you match it up against operators and partners and associates that will work with these areas.
Elaine, increasingly in our customers, we're talking about regional trade compliance, classifications, understanding what some of those commodities classifications are at a shipper end. Are you as a 3PL starting to invest in that DNA and knowledge base to help take some of that responsibility from your customer and to impart that knowledge for better supply chains? Is that something you see a 3PL can add value to? Or do you still see it at the shipper end, really?
No, I think, as 3PL, as the markets evolve, as the trends evolve, the flexibility needs to be there to absorb some of these requirements and also, be able to advise clients on some of that. So in a very small scale, we do some of that work for our clients. I think, some of the advisory requirements that are coming out from clients also provides us with opportunities to actually understand the clients better in terms of where they're going and what their challenges are. So I think it's all part of value-added services and part of integrated, services as well, for the various reasons, because there is a need to. But to be honest, everyone is struggling in some form, shape, or other in these compliance, tariffs, etc., and all that. And sometimes there are technicalities that are quite challenging. You don't necessarily get all the answers every time from the government or from the authorities. And sometimes the interpretation between countries
there's a difference, yeah.
which is really, the challenge for everyone else. So I think it needs to be a little bit more broader than what we offer today. So yes, we do include some of these as well as much as we can.
Vicar, is that an opportunity for the 3PLs, do you think, in Asia, to specialise in that and take that advisory role?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're certainly measuring it from, the interest, whether it comes in the way of RFQs or whether it comes in the way of strategic workshops that we're doing with clients. And we are seeing that, majority of the RFQs and the interest is coming more in areas like trade compliance, cross-border. Like I said yesterday, I think clients are now deadbeat with just the RFQs on point-to-point freight forwarding. They're probably looking at the next big thing that's going to happen. And given the size of this market as it's been defined now and it's been set up now, it's certainly something that is drawing a lot of, I wouldn't say second-level attention, but I'd certainly say that it's drawing a lot of strategic conversations between the shipper community and the 3PL as well.
We've got about 5 minutes before we go to break, so I am going to invite anyone that does have a question to throw your hands up and jump up and down and give me your attention. I'm conscious I've got almost my back to you, so just please, if you have a question, grab my attention or grab Oscar's attention in the back of the room. Jim, you've had a lot of experience in this area, and that is that we saw China release its 13th actionable plan a few weeks ago, right? The government targets, and they used to call it a plan. It's now a guideline. I guess that is the shifting sands of China, but double the nation's GDP by 2020, right, from 2010 numbers. New relationships for economic growth, whatever that may mean. High-tech agriculture investments, the other one that came out was services sector, investment sector. Big data was another one that was touched on in manufacturing. How much of those sort of strategic shifts, because that's language we haven't seen before, are going to affect our supply chain? How much of that will affect the continued strategy of the go west, young man, build inland? What are you hearing from your customers around those strategies and what that actually means?
So in my capacity, right, I think in the wearing the procurement hat, I think it's going to be more uncertainty in that sense, because I think definitely as a strategic procurement, you are signing contracts, you are buying services, warehouse, distribution, logistics, raw materials, especially depending on which industry, you tend to have to sign a lot of contract, a lot of uncertainty, right? So where are the risks? How do you manage those? And you look at the Chinese economy, it's not just the currency impact, it's also the fixed fuel. I think yesterday we talked a little bit, to some of the air carriers. It's always, they fix their fuel, it's not the freight forwarders. They don't, the freight forwarder definitely doesn't have that much autonomy over how to control fuel, whether it's the truck, the shipping line, or the air freight, FSC. The other aspect would be, I think with the changing shifts and the changing tide, if you look at Xi Jinping, he's trying to make sure that he's there at least for the next 5 to 10 years. So I think in that short runway of 5 years, what does that mean to companies who are already operating? And what does it mean for companies that are trying to go into China? And more important, is Hong Kong a stepping board to China? Because I think Hong Kong has lost its luster quite a fair bit, whether it's a financial hub or the R&D. The last part is also about talent. So you see the returnees, the strawberry generation, the people who are coming back from Singapore, US, Europe to work in China. What is the level of competency? How are they in their communication skill sets? And then I think the last one is about compliance and processes, because I think the Chinese still believe everything in Chinese language. I think that's going to change quite a lot in the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. Any questions at this point before we sort of break on to a break? No? I'm going to sort of quickly run down in the order. I'll start with you, Chris. So, quick word, in summary, what does our future supply chain look like in Asia? What should organisations be getting ready for? Where are our risks? In a quick.
I think you can't, again, I've gone back to the theme of my presentation, you can't ignore the technology. You've got to be looking at it. You've got to be thinking around what is the impact on these things, because those companies that get it right are going to streak ahead of those that don't. Okay, we've done some work looking at digital disruption, and again, it's across all industries, but most people are still thinking about it. They're still in the investigation stage. So at the minute, there's nobody who's really streaked ahead who we can actually put it out there as a leader, which means it's still an open playing field. But again, my one recommendation, you can't ignore it. You've got to look at it. And just think about how that's going to impact your processes, but also your organisation, because I think the organisation that we'll be talking to in 5 years' time is going to be very different from the organisation.
So technology, and more importantly, our consumers are becoming more savvy with technology and the way they interact with us. Marco, future, risks?
E-business is going to change a lot. So I think the number of order lines per cubic meter will go 5 to 10-fold in the coming 10 years.
Yep.
So that requires IT systems, proper IT systems. Many logistics companies, they invest less than 2% of their revenue in IT. That has to go much higher. We talk more in the range of 3.5 to 5%, which is also in line with other industries. Secondly, we have to relook at the distribution center. They are often too small, and also the roofs, for example, are not able to carry the weight of solar panels. So the future where distribution center need to be solar based, and also their floor strength, like in Malaysia, Indonesia, these are often not good enough, so that cannot facilitate any mechanization or even automation. So the DC has to be relooked at.
Lena, future risks?
Future Asia. I think in addition to what has been said, I think supply chains have to catch the growth trends very quickly. I think there is a changing growth trend around the world, and the reaction of supply chains has to be fast and quick. The other thing that we should also be mindful of is the flexibility aspect in our organizations need to happen at all levels. I think the global regional country, kind of a traditional outfit of organizations probably need to rebalance that a little bit and become a little bit more nimble and flexible in reacting to some of these trends. And I think, you know, that's where you need to, I think that's where the future is. You could be doing something, you could be responsible for a global role based in anywhere in Asia, or vice versa, you know, and that's the rule. You don't need to be in Asia to be in charge of, you know, just Asia or something like that.
Fantastic.
And I think the third aspect for future supply chain is still on the people side. Besides technology, I think people is still very fundamental to our business, regardless. And talent development in future supply chain is going to become more critical.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think I agree with Elaine. So I think especially when it comes to talents, it's a fair bit of learning, picking up really fast, relearning, unlearning. If you look at China this year, the other item that is high on the list is the Alibaba effect. So you see Alibaba versus JD.com versus Amazon, and you see how these three guys within the Chinese context are just making sure they're ready for the next curve, and everyone is deploying their own different unique strategy about building warehouse or absorbing or, you know, JD. The other one is, I think because of the economy slowing down, you will see more, whether it's acquisitions, M&A, or even joint ventures, because if you look at how the IBM EMC deal, or Dell EMC, it's not so much just the technology, it's going into healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So I think there will be more shifting of money, investments, as well as with that, you see market share, really everybody's trying to go ahead, because in the past you see changes every 5 years, 10 years, but today I think it's more like a 2-year cycle, 3-year cycle. So that's how you're going to operate in that environment, as well as a provider or as a customer or even a consumer of that product. Do you see that brand loyalty going on? So that's kind of my thing.
Vikram, final word from you.
I think I'd say probably two things. When you look at the 3PL asset side, I think asset utilization is going to become key. You know, how do you aggregate capacity? How do you aggregate, you know, your fulfillment and your utilization levels and try and improve that? You know, whether you're talking about what's happening with the shipping lines today, or whether you're talking about what happens with the trucking industry or the air freight industry. So I think that's really good. We're going to see, you know, big focus and enhanced improvements there. Basically because of what the industry is going through. And I think I agree with what Jimmy said. You know, there seems to be a pretty structural downturn in demand coming out of Asia for now. On the client side, I think it's just a question of, you know, your ability to respond to changes in your supply chain as quickly as possible. And there you could be talking about disruptions in supply chain. Tianjin is a good example. You know, we're starting to see a lot of clients talking about things like FCBA, for example. You know, how do I mitigate myself on things of that kind? And they're not trying to talk about changes in policy on the ground, because that's always difficult to do, but they're talking about what it means for them from an inventory carrying cost, and what, you know, an arm's length process from FCPA would do to you on the ground if you were to adopt that approach and manage your business that way. So I think that's the
So I mean, what I'm hearing is technology, got to look at your investments, reconfiguration of your DCs, which enable you to capture that market. Got to have an eye on the future, what's next. Got to build nimbleness. You just touched on the flexibility, the need for nimbleness. There's a shifting initiative in the investment landscape between industries and sectors, but most importantly, people are the enablers. And without all of that, the whole thing doesn't kind of come together. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go to a break now. So we'll be back in the room at 11:15. Please put your hands together for our esteemed panelists this morning and their expertise.